and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 287, interview with Damien Lewis about his latest book, Churchill's Shadow Raiders, The Race to Develop Radar, World War II's Invisible Secret Weapon. Damien Lewis is a #1 best-selling author. For decades, he worked as a war and conflict reporter for the world's major broadcasters, reporting from across Africa, South America, the Middle and Far East, and winning numerous awards. His books include the World War II classics SAS Ghost Patrol, Churchill's Secret Warriors, The Nazi Hunters, and Hunting the Nazi Bomb. Today he joins us to discuss his newest book, Churchill's Shadow Raiders, the men who carried out Operation Biting and how its outcome affected the rest of the war. Mr. Lewis, thank you very much for being with us today.
Very good to be here, thank you.
I have to say, considering the date of this operation, which serves as the backbone for your book, I am so glad to have you on because I'm in the same time zone in my podcast, but in the Pacific. So this episode of yours can be a rare bright spot during those dark days of the war in Europe and now in Southeast Asia. So how did this book come about?
Yeah, so I was giving a talk to a literary festival. It was a military literary festival in England about 2 years ago, maybe slightly longer, and on one of my books. And at the end, a guy came up to me, quite an elderly gentleman, and he said, that talk was amazing. He said, but I run the local radar historical society. And he said, I don't suppose you know much about the radar wars in Second World War. No one seems to. Right. And I said, well, actually, I do know quite a lot about it because I've always been fascinated by Operation Biting, which was a commando raid in 1942 to steal the Germans' top secret radar. But I said, can't write a book about it because there's nothing new to tell.
Right.
And he had this kind of whimsical smile. And he said, we've just saved the whole of the British radar archive from World War II from destruction. And kind of let that, drop right. like an atom bomb between us. At which stage I said, how, why, where? And he said, well, basically, the entire British radar archive, so that's all the documents, all the photographs, everything was stored on the site of the World War II radar establishment, and then eventually it was privatized, and they were decommissioning the site, and it just got forgotten, and it got left to rot in all these abandoned hangars, and literally was slated to be pulped and destroyed. And him and a bunch of former radar military, experts and technicians found out about it. And they managed to get Kinetic, the global military company, to sponsor facilities in which they saved the whole of this archive, so all these massive rooms, and basically got it out of where it was going to be destroyed and put it somewhere where it could be catalogued and studied and preserved for posterity. And to put it in context, he said to me when we met, we've probably only even looked at 10% of the material.
Wow.
And at that stage, you're like, well, when does a military historian ever get the chance to pour through a massive World War II archive of such importance, most of which has never been seen since the Second World War? So, kind of the rest became a shoo-in, didn't it?
That's an incredible story. The only way it could be any better is if you had said he and his elderly friends burst in with guns and took all the papers. That's the only thing that could have made that more exciting. But that is absolutely incredible. And again, it's a part of that. And we've seen this before where things get lost or things get forgotten, especially in this day and age. And people just want to move on to the future and forget the past. But it's worth remembering. So I'm glad that happened.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely.
So considering the story in your book, the raid that you cover in your book, I think it's worth remembering before we go into the details about this type of air operation was practically a new thing. It was being pushed by Churchill. Some of the military didn't like it for various reasons, but if you could give us an overview of the first attempt when it comes to airborne assaults, Operation Colossus, I think that would give the story that you're about to tell a lot better context.
Yeah, sure. So it really starts, after Dunkirk, when the British and French armies were basically thrown off the European continent by the Nazi blitzkrieg, fighting heroically but massively outnumbered and outgunned. And just a few days after Dunkirk, Churchill gave a speech in Parliament and exhorted the British nation to stand and fight and find the will to fight and find the will to go on the offensive. And as a result of that, an extraordinarily maverick and crazy-minded individual called Dudley Clark, Colonel Dudley Clark, whose most famous exploit in the war, by the way, was to be captured dressed as a woman on an espionage mission in neutral Spain, and a very convincing woman he was as well. Anyway, Clark heard Churchill's exhortation for the British nation to find the will to fight. And he had been brought up in South Africa, where during the Boer War, and he'd seen the Boer Commandos in operation. So these were South Africans who basically used their own weapons, their own horses, their own bush dress, mainly farmers, to raise a militia to fight against the British. And this was guerrilla warfare. And around about 50,000 Boer Commandos had tied down 350,000 British troops and given them a hiding on quite a few occasions. And Clark had been hugely impressed. And so Clark went to Churchill and said, why don't we form the British version of the Commandos? And Churchill, again, a fellow maverick, cometh the hour, cometh the man, the only man that could have saved Britain at that time, but a real maverick and a real experimenter with an extraordinary mind. And Churchill embraced this concept, and he exhorted Clark to get the first raid back across the Channel to attack the Germans within the month. And if you think about the fact we'd lost 70,000 men, hundreds of thousands of tanks and field guns and weaponry, that was an incredible thing to ask him to achieve. Clark went ahead and did that. That was the first seaborne commando raid. Literally within the month, they got back across the Channel and they attacked a German outpost. Right. But Churchill had seen the Germans use airborne operations during the Blitzkrieg. And by that I mean, if you remember, they attacked the Belgian forts, which were supposed to be impregnable, using both parachutists, so paratroopers, and glider-borne troops. And that's how they took the Belgian forts, and the Blitzkrieg rolled into France. And Churchill had been hugely impressed. And he was convinced that airborne operations would be key to winning the war. So he exhorted Clark, I don't just want seaborne commandos, I want airborne commandos as well. And so Clark went about raising a force of, he was supposed to recruit 5,000 airborne operators by the end of the war. Now, bear in mind at this stage, when they set up the airborne training school, they brought in circus high wire acts. They brought in stuntsmen. There was no one who knew how to do this stuff. So this was making it up from scratch. And because the top brass, the military high command, was so obsessed by the idea that the Germans were going to invade Britain, and therefore we had to have a defensive mindset and concentrate all our resources on building the defences of Britain, the idea you might send airborne raiders hundreds of miles behind German lines to attack them where they least expected it, this was heresy. And Churchill basically had no support from high command. And they argued there were no resources, it was not possible, it was not even the appropriate thing to do. But doggedly and amazingly and with such single-minded spirit, Churchill, Clark and a few other like-minded individuals went ahead and raised their airborne cadre. And then, of course, they needed a mission. And the Special Operations Executive, which was Churchill's Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare, the deniable top-secret fourth arm of the military that he set up to basically break all the rules of war and carry out those missions that you cannot officially do, like assassinations, raising terrorist armies, any kind of skullduggery which really you shouldn't be getting up to. The SOE already had a plan to blow up an aqueduct in Italy which provided fresh drinking water to 3 million Italians living in and around the key ports of Taranto, Brindisi, and the others on the southern Italian coast, from which all the war material was being dispatched to North Africa for the North Africa campaign. And so if you could blow up the aqueduct, deprive those 3 million Italians of drinking water, you'd shut down the ports, and it could turn the tide of the fortunes in North Africa. So it was incredibly, exciting proposition. But the idea of killing 3 million Italians, most of whom were civilians, of death by thirst, was kind of somewhat controversial,
right.
Probably against the Geneva Convention on many, many counts. Mm-hmm. And of course, it took Churchill, Churchill with balls of steel and a real courage and vision to sign off on that. Right. And to give it his blessing. But then it needed a team of raiders who could get in to carry out the operation. You couldn't get in from the sea because the Taranto aqueduct was right in the middle of Italy in the mountains. So there's no way you could land the seaborne force and they would get there without being captured. So it had to be an airborne operation. And that required flying from the UK around about 900 kilometres to Italy to find a tiny drop zone in the midst of the Italian Apennine Mountains, and to drop a force of raiders with enough explosives to blow up the aqueduct, bearing in mind there had never been an Allied airborne operation before. Right. And so in February 41, that mission was launched. It was called Operation Colossus, the first ever airborne operation by Allied forces, and 36 raiders parachuted into the Italian mountains, and they did blow up the aqueduct and cut off the water supply to all those people that had been targeted. An absolutely incredible undertaking.
Right. But I think what's going to help support the naysayers, like you say in your book, is one, I don't think they've realized that it was successful at first because it was hard to tell. And also, if I remember correctly, I think all of the operatives were captured. And so as far as the naysayers are concerned, this was a massive failure. But of course, they don't realize all the details yet.
You're absolutely right. So what happened with Colossus is they got in, they blew up the aqueduct. Mm-hmm. And then they were supposed to march to the Italian coast and get picked up by the British submarine HMS Triumph and taken back to friendly shores. Right. However, 48 hours after the attack, a British reconnaissance aircraft flew over the valley and took photographs of the attack site. And because it did so from around about 10, 15,000 feet vertically above the aqueduct, and because the aqueduct had dropped vertically where they'd blown up the piers, it appeared to those studying the photographs that the aqueduct was still intact. And so the message went back to British headquarters to London that the mission had been a failure. And then the War Office held an extraordinary meeting at which they decided the only way the mission could have failed was if all the raiders had been captured, and therefore there was no point sending in HMS Triumph to collect them because, of course, they were all in the bag. And so the submarine was turned around, and duly all the Operation Colossus raiders were captured, and one of them, who was actually Italian of birth, was immediately shot as a traitor, and the rest went into captivity. So yes, the official reports on Colossus branded it an abject failure, and therefore the naysayers were given absolute carte blanche to criticize and carp against airborne operations, saying exactly what they'd always maintained, that these were impractical, unproven, and a waste of resources.
But as you said a moment ago, at the very least, Churchill is someone who is irrepressible, and the dash and the daring of this kind of raid, even though it appeared at first not to be successful, it's not something he's going to let go. But at the same time, and you point this out very well in your book, Churchill can't just do whatever he wants. He can't just give an order and then everything falls into place. I mean, parts of the military were, very steeped in tradition, were giving some pushback. And so this is not just an easy decision for him to make. There's going to be some fighting, and this is going to take time, which brings in to the story the idea of another raid in the future. But before we get to that, could you introduce us to Claude Wavell? He's looking at an aerial reconnaissance photograph. There's a small dot in the photograph that's nagging him. He can't quite figure it out. And so this is going to lead to an incredible story all on its own.
Yeah, sure. Just before I do that, one other point. I mean, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. But the other thing to bear in mind is this, okay? Mm-hmm. When Churchill proposed that the Commandos should be called the Commandos, the War Office blocked it. And they said, you can't call them the Commandos because that suggests they're like the original Boer Commandos, who wore no uniform, had no officers, didn't salute, had no military discipline, and were basically guerrilla fighters.
Right.
And Churchill said that's entirely the point. and
that's what he wants.
And the War Office said, no, you should call them, because they were called the Special Service Volunteers, because you had to volunteer to join Special Service. You should call them, and I'm not joking, you should call them the Special Service Volunteers, or the SS for short.
Oh, God.
And at which point it was pointed out you may as well call them the Gestapo. And Churchill, Churchill won the argument, and they became the Commandos formally. But they were deeply unpopular with the military high command, which was traditionalist, still steeped in all the rigors and traditions of the military going back to the First World War. So yes, there was a fight on their hands.
Wow.
And then, as you say, Claude Wavell, who was a brilliant photo analyst. So I think it's a fact that's little known even to students of the Second World War, that anything up to 80% of all intelligence used in battle was actually from aerial photographs, played an absolutely pivotal and key role. And the craft was really perfected by the RAF, the Royal Air Force, at RAF Medmenham, which was a grand country house in the south of England. And actually at RAF Medmenham, by the end of the war, half the staff were Americans, because the Americans sent over their photo analysts and their experts to learn the craft from the RAF, and it was a brilliant tie-up between the two countries. Anyway, RAF Medmenham, Claude Wavell was studying a photograph of a French clifftop installation, and they were searching for what they believed to be was a German radar, a paraboloid dish, so a absolutely groundbreaking piece of technology if it existed, something way, way beyond anything that we might have. And the reason they believed that the Germans had it was because the losses being suffered by Bomber Command were mounting exponentially and were becoming unsustainable, which would mean we could no longer carry on sending the bomber missions into Nazi-occupied Europe, which was key. And as Claude Wavell studied this photograph, this dot, which could just be a cow on the cliff top, it might even be a speck of dust on the film. Right. He just had this sixth sense that maybe this was the elusive German paraboloid radar. And so he challenged an incredibly brave and talented RAF pilot called Tony Hill, Flight Officer Tony Hill, to carry out what they called a dicing mission. And these were missions flown literally at 100 feet of altitude, if that. Wow. So low that you could get in close enough to capture your target in absolute close-up detail. And that was the kind of photograph you needed to prove the dot was the paraboloid radar, if it was. And he challenged Tony Hill to carry out a dicing mission over those French cliffs, which Tony Hill did. He flew the first day, saw the paraboloid with his own eyes, and confirmed it was there. But when he got back, the film... the camera had malfunctioned, there was no film. So he went back the next day, which you were absolutely forbidden to do, because obviously if he flown one day, the Germans would maybe be forewarned and forearmed, roared up over the French cliff tops in his polished duck-egg blue Spitfire, unarmed, by the way, so that they had less weight, so they could outrun any German fighter planes. Right. Fired off his film, came back and captured what are probably the most iconic photographs of the whole war. And they showed the Würzburg, this paraboloid dish, sat across atop the French cliff tops, pointing out across the channel to Britain, and just behind it a very ugly 1920 style French chateau, which was the radar headquarters. Right. And so Wavell then had in his hands proof that the Germans had this absolutely groundbreaking, cutting edge directional radar, which, bear in mind, the British radar was chain home, these 200 to 300 foot tall monolithic stationary towers built atop our cliffs. Right. Compared that to what the Germans had, this was a whole different ballgame. And so we simply had to find out what this thing could do, because it could determine the course of the war.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the stats that you gave in your book, but there were tens of thousands of losses in Bomber Command because it turns out the Germans had this incredibly advanced radar, and yet there were those in Britain who said, we are the only ones, we invented it, no one else has got radar, you're completely wrong. And so there's going to be even more internal squabbles when people are trying to say, look, here's proof, we have to make some kind of progress on this, which brings in another new player into the story, Reginald Victor Jones, another brilliant person who's going to figure into the story, and he gets involved. But the thing about him is, if I remember from your book correctly, is it he that has Churchill's ear?
Yeah, absolutely. So Reginald Victor Jones, known to everyone as R.V. Jones, young, in his 20s, an upstart, as viewed by the scientific establishment and the military hierarchy, A.P. Watts, the so-called father of radar, the British scientist, he believed the British invented radar. Absolutely wrong. The Germans had invented it 30 years ago. Right. But Watt was convinced, the British nation had a tendency, still does, you could argue, to be very arrogant. And Watt was a personification of that arrogance. And so whereas R.V. Jones absolutely knew from anecdotal evidence, the losses of Bomber Command, the accuracy of the German flak and their fighters, he knew something was vectoring the German anti-aircraft fire and the fighters onto our bomber streams. He knew that. The way the searchlights were directed immediately onto our fighters, something was finding them, something incredibly accurate and incredibly advanced. But the naysayers kept arguing that R.V. Jones was wrong. Churchill was very open to R.V. Jones's perspective, but he needed proof. He needed proof as much as anyone else to prove and to show to the naysayers, you've got it wrong, and the Germans do have this. And so R.V. Jones, who actually worked unusually for the Secret Intelligence Service, he was known as the scientist to the spies and was charged with finding all that incredible German technology, which was in advance of our own. He was charged, along with the people at RAF Medmenham, to go find this technology, which was causing us so much harm.
That is incredible. Yeah, so he's going to have his own difficulties in doing this because, as you said in the book, the planes would come over, they're found even like 20 miles or whatever out, and so the Germans are more than ready for them. So it's going to be horrific. They have to do something. So if you could maybe set up the story of Operation Biting for us. And again, I just encourage everybody to get the book because we're going to leave out so many details, but that's just the way things go. But if you could kind of introduce us to this idea and some of the training and the men involved, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So it was clear to those, to R.V. Jones, to Wavell, to Churchill, all those people who saw these incredible reconnaissance photographs of this Würzburg radar dish sat atop the French cliff tops. It was clear that just below there was a beach. So if you've got a beach, supposedly you can steal the radar, carry it down the cliff, and take it off the beach by boat. Wow. The problem was you'd never land a force of commandos on the beach to raid it because it was menaced by any number of German machine gun posts. It would be a suicide mission. And therefore, the only way to steal the Würzburg radar was to go in by air and parachute just behind the installation on the cliffs and come in and take it and then be taken off by sea, which meant the second ever airborne raid by British parachutists would have to be mounted. So following on from Colossus, and of course, when everybody studied the raid that had gone before, it was still officially cast as a disaster. And this cast a major cloud over whether Operation Biting, as the radar theft mission was codenamed, would actually get the go-ahead or not. By now, the chief of combined operations, so the guy really in charge of special forces, was Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was a cousin to the king, and he was a like-minded free thinker and maverick like Churchill. And Mountbatten, with royal blood, it was hard to stand in the way of somebody like that. So you now had a bit more impetus and a bit more clout behind airborne operations, and the guys who started training for Operation Biting were really the best of the airborne raiders that had earned their jump wings so far. Many of them came from Scottish regiments because there is a very, very long-lived, as you know, military tradition in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, and they were under the command of not General Frost at the time, but Colonel Frost, who would go on to become famous during the Arnhem operations, Operation Market Garden.
Right.
Immortalised in the movie A Bridge Too Far. This was, of course, going to be Frost's first airborne operation, as it would be for all the 120 men under his command. So they started this absolutely rigorous and brutal training in the midst of winter in the Scottish lochs and highlands, training for this airborne operation. The problem, though, was this: whilst they were experts as far as it went in airborne operations and parachute landings, and that side of the operation didn't particularly worry them, they would then have to steal the radar and lay them down with all that heavy loot. They would have to then rendezvous with basically small landing craft on the beach and be taken off by the Royal Navy. And they would have to do that all at night under fire. And during every single dress rehearsal, and there were many, not one was successful. Either they ended up in the wrong place and didn't make the rendezvous, or they ended up the right place and made the rendezvous with the boats, but the boats got stuck on a falling tide and they had to wade back to shore defeated. And so by the time the moon window, which is a period when the moonlight is bright enough for pilots to navigate just by the lie of the land, by the time the February 1942 moon window came along, which was the scheduled time for the operation, there had not been one single operation dress rehearsal of the mission that had gone to plan.
That's incredible, because you stress in your book about, there are some people who are thinking, look, this is going to be Colossus all over again. And like you said, the military is generally defensive-minded, which is not the worst thing in the world. They don't have the time, the men, the resources to waste on operations like this. But on the other hand, if you keep sending bombers over, you're going to have unsustainable losses, because you mentioned in your book when there's a lot of deaths through Bomber Command, those are their best pilots. Those are their trained pilots, the veterans, and now they're having new people come in, and so you're just going to lose quality when it comes to your pilots. It's just a vicious cycle. Something has to happen. So you're right, with Mountbatten and Churchill, that's probably the only reason this was able to move forward, but it's just sheer desperation on their part.
It is, and bear in mind, think of the stakes here, okay? In terms of Western Europe, where has the ground war been fought before D-Day? It's been fought on the Eastern Front, yeah? And millions of lives have been lost. And what have the Russians been saying? They've been saying, come on, Britain, come on, America.
Right.
Come to our aid, help us open a second front. And America and Britain have rightly said, look, we're getting ready, D-Day's going to happen, but you've got to give us time. And in the meantime, the Russians said, well, do something. And the one thing the Brits and the Americans were able to do was send in the bombers to pound to smithereens the German factories making the war machines that were allowing the Wehrmacht to drive towards Moscow and to defeat the Russians on the East Front. So getting the bombers through was absolutely critical. Without that, there was a chance that the Russians would cut a peace deal with Nazi Germany and Hitler could turn all his attention back to us. And so stealing this radar and defeating the threat against our bomber operations was absolutely key. It could not be allowed to fail.
Right. And of course, for someone like me who doesn't have the background that you do when it comes to radar, for me, one of the great ironies was, because the German unit was so advanced compared to the British, it was very compact. So the idea of taking parts of it or most of it is actually feasible, whereas you couldn't do that with the British system because it's so massive. So finally, Operation Biting, and I just love that name because I'm trying to remember what Mountbatten said, something about give the enemy a good biting or something like that. It's given the green light. So if you could talk us through the raid. And I have to tell you right now that as I was reading this part of the book, I was completely mesmerized. I was on edge, but at the same time, I was backing away from my book, trying to distance myself from the images that you were painting with your words. This was truly a harrowing experience for these guys. They can be as trained as they want, but I think you said in the book, all plans pretty much go out the window once you make contact with the enemy.
Absolutely, yeah. So as they, and as they got the green light to finally depart from the UK in the fleet of aircraft, Mountbatten sent them a message saying, "Go bite 'em hard." Yeah, and indeed, Frost and his 120 raiders intended to. The problem was, of course, you're flying in a fleet of basically converted bombers across the Channel. You're flying down the very throat of the thing which is dying to find you.
Yes.
So it's more or less as soon as you start your journey, you are flying into a storm of lead, a storm of fire, because as soon as they were across the Channel, the German radar obviously picked them up and was tracking them the whole way. And so as soon as they were in range, the fleet of 12 bombers packed with these very, very, very heroic and brave men came under horrendous fire. And in the process of executing their evasive maneuvers, the first 4 aircraft dropped the first tranche of parachutists into a valley which looked exactly like the valley where the radar was situated, until the men got on the ground, whereupon Lieutenant Charteris, he was known as junior to his men because he was only 21 years old, which is something else I always stress. Think of the age, the youth of these men charged to do this operation. Think of the weight upon their shoulders. When Lieutenant Charteris landed in that valley, he paused for a moment, having broken out their weapons from the containers and armed his men, and said, "This is the wrong place."
Oh, God. Right.
It wasn't right. And he realized they'd been dropped in the wrong location. Wow. And bear in mind, this was crucial because Charteris and his force, first down, they had probably the most important task of all. There's no point in stealing the radar. And bear in mind that Frost had a shopping list of all the bits of the radar that the boffins needed. There's no point in stealing all those pieces if, when you try to get to the beach, it's in German hands and you get mowed down. So Charteris's force are charged to be first in and secure the breach. And actually, they've been dropped in the wrong place. And so Charteris tries to think to himself, have we been dropped before the proper drop zone or after it? Because that depends which direction he marches his men in. And he watched the next aircraft come over, and he just gambled on what he saw. And he said, "We've been dropped short. We've got to move northwards. Follow me." But he basically said, "We will march to the sound of the guns." That meant where we first hear the first gunfire, that's where we got to be.
Wow.
And indeed they did. That's exactly what they did. As Junior Charteris and his men ran northwards, laden down with all their weaponry, eventually they heard the sound of the first fighting as Frost and his men attacked and seized the radar pits. And they ran to the sound of the fighting. And in that way, issuing the Scottish war cry, which I can't sadly do in Gaelic because I can't speak Gaelic, but it basically means, it translates as the antlers of the deer, and yelling that blood-curdling Scottish war cry, they ran down the gorge which leads to the beach, assaulted the German positions and took the beach, and it fell into Allied hands. And meanwhile, Frost and his raiders have taken the radar pits. The radar expert, a chap called Flight Sergeant Cox, who's been bolted onto the mission at the last moment, has managed to dismantle all of the pieces on the shopping list. And they've got shopping trolleys, I kid you not. They've got foldable, canvas-sided shopping trolleys. And they've loaded all the radar kit into the shopping trolleys. And bear in mind, it's February, and the French cliffs are thick with snow. And they push their shopping trolleys loaded with all the stolen radar kit through the snow, having left demolition charges on the radar pit to blow it up, what remains of it. And they've got to the cliff tops, fought their way down and got to the beach. And then, of course, when they believed that, they'd really pulled it off and it was all over, the worst possibly happened, which was that the French sea mist had rolled in, and the signal that they had to give to call the Royal Navy in with the landing craft wasn't seen by the flotilla waiting just offshore because of the mist. And so Frost had to basically set defensive positions, knowing very shortly, they could even hear the engines. The German heavy armor and armored cars would be arriving to wipe all out. And it was only because the commander of the Royal Naval Flotilla, a chap called Cook, who was actually from the Royal Australian Navy, it was only because he, pretty much against his orders, just sent the landing craft in anyway, without seeing the signal, not knowing what they were going to find, that they actually got to the shore, pulled Frost and his men off, got the radar loot to board one of the very fast motor torpedo boats, and rushed it back to Britain.
I have to let you know that during 2 points of that part of the book, which it felt like it just, in some ways it went on forever, and in other ways it was over in a second, because that's how, it's how dramatic this is. When they're undoing parts on the dish, for lack of a better word, the Wurzburg, and they're being shot at, and you can just hear the bullets pinging off. So the very thing that they've come to take apart and to get is, and at the same time, saving them from being shot by the Germans who are getting ever closer. And when they're on the beach and the radios aren't working, some of them don't have radios because maybe they were lost during the drop, I'm trying to remember. But no one's communicating with anybody. The boats are out there. They can't see the men on the beach. The men are on the beach. They can't see the boats. That just was driving me crazy. And I swear I was biting my nails at that point going, what is possibly going to happen? Don't tell me that everybody's going to die and this is going to be ruined. But you're right. The one guy breaks the rules, which was needed. The men are found, but not everybody got off the beach.
No, it's fascinating because during the training of the raid, they trained one of the commandos to use a flash flash camera with real film. This was all the age of digital technology, and so as they're taking apart the radar dish, and as they're under this horrendous fire, one of the one of the individuals starts to take photographs, and of course, every time he takes a photograph, there's a massive flash. Right. The radar dish and all the radars are silhouetted in the flash, and the Germans have a brilliant target to aim at. And eventually,
shoot here, shoot here, please.
And eventually, Frost, the commander, has to yell out, "Stop taking bloody photographs!" There are parts of it which were kind of this bizarre, macabre black comedy. But you're absolutely right. As they pull away from the beach, and as Commander Cook makes that brilliant and very brave decision to go in and rescue them anyway, as they're pulling away, Frost finally gets a radio signal from the shore. Yeah. And he thinks, well, how can I have a radio signal from the shore? All my men should be aboard the ships. And he realizes that it's some of the signalers calling to be picked up, and 6 men have been left behind. And the reason they got left behind was largely because, some of them are injured, but the others are those individuals who are trained as medics and had lingered to try to tend to the injuries of their comrades. Right. And so those 6 have been left on the beach. And in due course, those guys get captured.
Even though it's a very short moment in the book, when Frost finds out, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at first I think he only knows about 2 people that were left behind, but there were really 6. You could just feel the angst coming from him, like, we've got to turn around, we've got to go get these men, we've done all this, we've sacrificed so much, but the mission is bigger than his desire to save his men. If you don't get that information back to London, this has all been for nothing, and the dark days will just continue. But that just moment where you just feel him wanting to forget everything just to save those men, I mean, that's what, I don't know, working together and practicing and training together, it just bonds you, I think, like no other occupation in the world.
Yeah, so Frost gets the radio message, and his immediate instinctive reaction, without a second of hesitation, is we're turning around and going back in. Right. He would have done that, of course, but bear in mind they are now on Royal Navy ships, and they're no longer. It's no longer Frost in command. It's Cook in command, the Royal Naval Commander of the Tormentor Flotilla. That's what they called the flotilla of boats that were there to rescue him. And Cook rightly says, "Oh no, you're not. Yeah. We're heading back to Britain, and those men are being left behind." Hellishly hard decision to take, but the right one. Yes. And you're absolutely right. Again, when you've trained and bonded and fought alongside and bled alongside, your fellow comrades on the front line of war, there is no other bond like that. And that's why Frost did not want to leave his men behind.
And you're right, because whenever you watch movies, Hollywood movies of war, it's always these guys in their 30s, that kind of stuff. But these are kids. I mean, like you said, some of them are 19, 20, 21.
Yep.
There were two gentlemen who figured out that they had a birthday that was one day apart, and they were going to be 21. They were not even 21, if I remember correctly, one of them doesn't make it.
Yeah, so it's Lieutenant Charteris and his one of his fellows on the flight in, and they're the guys that get dropped in the wrong valley. But whenever I speak about this book, which I do a lot, I just get people to pause for a second in the audience. I say, consider their youth. Consider what they were taking on. Consider the burden of command. Consider the responsibility of knowing if you failed in Operation Biting in this mission, you might fail to change the course of the war in our favor. And imagine taking all that on board and you're not even yet 21.
I was barely figuring out who I was at 21, much less any kind of responsibility. But you get the sense that they go out as a 20-year-old, they go through this mission, and the ones that come back, it doesn't matter their age anymore. They're now veterans. They probably have a different appreciation. The war has been brought home to them, and you just get the sense that it transforms them regardless of age.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you often read accounts, from guys in these kind of units, in particular in the Second World War, and they say, we came out of the mission as old men.
Right.
So it doesn't just age you in terms of maturity; it ages you in terms of physical and mental exhaustion. Right. So these guys came back, and yes, they had pulled off one of the most extraordinary raids of the war, and certainly, incredible part of the story. So, when the Germans inspected the radar pit and realised the Würzburg was no more, of course, we had blown up the radar pit with demolition charges to try to hide the fact from the Germans that we'd stolen it. Do you understand?
Right. Yes.
Because if the Germans knew we'd stolen it, they'd then think, okay, if they've stolen our Würzburg, they're going to try and do things to blind and block our Würzburg. But if they just thought it was a raid to blow it up, they might not have those suspicions. So we'd blown the radar pit up. But in dash down the cliff tops, Frost and his men had to abandon the trolleys, the shopping trolleys, and all their wrecking gear, so all the wrenches and hammers and chisels. And so it was clear that this had been a snatch and grab mission, and not a standard raid. And so you're now the German commander, okay? You've realised that under your watch, and bear in mind, you could be serving on the Eastern Front, and serving in Normandy is a cushy little number in running a radar station, and you've just realised that under your watch, the Brits have been over and stolen probably the most top secret and sensitive bit of German technology that existed at that time. And you're thinking, someone's got to tell Hitler. And I kid you not, they didn't tell him for 48 hours because no one could pluck up the courage. And when they did, he went absolutely apoplectic. He was beside himself with rage. And all those units, so that's the army units tasked with the security and the Luftwaffe units who were tasked with running the radar installations, all those units were summarily removed from France and sent to the Eastern Front, where most of them perished.
Right. Oh, my goodness, yeah. And now, incredible as it may sound to the listeners, this story is far from over because they've got this technology, but this is where the scientists and the engineers have to get involved in this. Even R.V. Jones has got to get in, and he's going to be able to tell when he takes a look at all the various parts that they brought back. One, not only have the Germans, have their own version of it, it is superior, and it's been around for quite some time, relatively speaking.
Yeah, so one of the really fascinating. One of the top items on the shopping list, item number one on the shopping list of what to steal was the aerial that span around in the center of the dish. Right. But very near the top of the list was steal all the labels. So these are metal labels riveted onto each of the components. The reason being, the Germans, as we all know, are extremely efficient. They like keeping records.
Oh, yes.
Very good at record keeping. And every single label had a sequential number. And so by studying the labels alone, they could work out, of course, the year of manufacture, which was 1939, but much more importantly, how many units were being manufactured per month, okay? And so from that, they extrapolated that the Germans had started manufacturing the Würzburg in 1939, and since then they had made thousands, which meant the whole of the coastline of Nazi-occupied Europe would be defended by Würzburg radar stations. And so there was no way through. Apart from, interesting, immediately after stealing this Würzburg, so this one radar installation, Bomber Harris seized the moment, literally 2 or 3 days later, sent 300 British bomber aircraft through the French defense, the German defenses on the French coast at that very point, where there was no longer Würzburg, got them through without losing any, got them over Paris, bombed the Renault plant, which then was making war machines for the German military, pretty much destroyed it, and got them all home, barring 3 aircraft. An incredibly successful mission. And that just went to show what you could achieve if you could get rid of the radar, the all-seeing eye in the sky.
But even then, it's incredible because the Germans are going to replace that one. This is a one-off thing, and yes, it feels good to be able to announce the success of the mission. Yes, it's good to be able to announce this one particular bombing raid, but nothing's changed if they don't do something with this technology because they still can't get through to bomb, to render or weaken the war production capabilities of the Germans all over Europe. So this is only getting started.
Yeah, so 2 things change. Mm-hmm. The first thing that changes is this. Churchill, Frost, the commander of Operation Biting, is having a bath in his quarters, literally hours after getting home from the mission.
Right.
There's a knock on the door, and his batman says, "Sir, you're wanted in Whitehall," so in London, at the head of the British government. Right. And Frost has to jump out of the bath, dress, jump in a car that's waiting. He's whisked up to London, and he's whisked into the war rooms, Churchill's war rooms, which are these fantastic subterranean bunkers and basements which run below Whitehall.
Right.
And he's waiting in a room, not knowing what on earth he's been called for. and all the greater the good of the political and military establishment start filtering into the room. And then, beatific as ever, Churchill turns up, and he's got this rare for that. The last few months when it's been very, very dark indeed on all fronts for the Allies, Churchill turns up with a rare smile on his face, and he says to Frost, "Tell me the story of the raid." And so Frost relates the whole blow by blow account of what happened. And in the war rooms, they've got the scale model that was made at RAF Medmenham, the photo reconnaissance center. They got the scale model of the cliffs and the Würzburg and the radar headquarters. And Churchill, when Frost has finished, goes up to the scale model and he runs a finger down the cliff, following the route that the Frost and his men brought the radar down to the beach. Mm-hmm. And he says, "These raids, there must be more of them, because Operation Biting already has achieved something incredibly significant. It's proven to the British people and the American people and all our military commanders the concept of airborne operations, raids behind enemy lines, can work and can score incredible battle successes." That's one massive achievement of Operation Biting immediately. But secondly, the radar, the components of the radar are taken to the laboratories of the boffins, where R.V. Jones and his colleagues sit down and start to reassemble it. And in doing so, they have one great ally, which is that they've taken 3 Germans prisoners of war during the raid, and they've dragged them back to British shores. One of them, who's a radar technician who worked on the installation, happens to be extremely willing to help the British. By sheer chance, at the start of the war, his wife had been pregnant. with their first child, and he'd asked for permission for leave to go back and be there at the birth of his child, and his commanding officer in the German military had refused. And by the time he got home, his infant child had died, so he'd never got to see his child. And since then, he had been less than compliant in terms of the positions he'd been placed in the German military, and he'd ended up spending a lot of time in German military prisons. Yeah. And so when he's brought to Britain, and R.V. Jones sits him down and says, look, help us and we can help you. You'll last out the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp, but it's not too bad. Compare that to being on the Eastern Front. Yeah. Heller is the guy's name, proves remarkably helpful. And he sits down and he duly shows R.V. Jones and his colleagues how to clip back together the Würzburg like a giant piece of Meccano. And lo and behold, they plug it into the electricity and they're able to fire it back up and Frankenstein-like breathe life back into it and get it working. And from that, they're able to study it. From that, they're able to work out the frequencies upon which it broadcasts. And because it's tunable over a very large range of frequencies, they realize it's going to be hellishly difficult to jam by traditional electronic signals. Right. But by the greatest of ironies, in a way. I mean, Churchill, an amazing man, as I say, the man of the hour, the man who, gave us the will to fight, kept the flame of resistance alive until, the Americans, could come in and join us. Churchill was a really, really accomplished amateur scientist. And as early as 1937, he'd been studying radar, and he'd said, might it be possible, and I'm paraphrasing, to scatter in the sky tinfoil strips to mimic the radar signature of bombers and confuse the enemy's radar. Right. And there's a female professor called Joan Curran working with R.V. Jones and others, and she sits down and starts to study whether this idea of using tinfoil strips to blind the Würzburg is possible. And the more they study it, the more she refines the length and the thickness to cut the tinfoil strips to, the more they realize this will work. And eventually they invent something which they codename Window, which are these massive bales of tinfoil strips which you tip out of a bomber's bomb bay as you're flying in on a mission, and which disperses in the air, and each tiny tinfoil strip produces on the Würzburg screen the exact same radar echo as a bomber, and it looks like there are tens of thousands of bombs all across the German skies. And that's how they work out, having stolen the Würzburg, the way to blind it.
God. And I think it's R.V. Jones that reminds Churchill, it's like, you had this idea years ago. You're right. It was just a moment of insight from a very inquisitive mind, which proves fruitful. And now, finally, after everything they've been through, they do have something to counter the German radar. But there's still going to be fights. Do we use it? Do we tip our hand? So the contest between, maybe you could call it the naysayers and the more proactive people, or maybe just the more conservative or whatever, their internal battles are not over with yet.
Yeah, so, back to the same old. Those individuals at the top of the British scientific establishment and military establishment argue Window should not be used. And their reasoning is, if we use Window, we scatter it across the German skies. Obviously, the Germans are going to find it in the morning, being eaten by German cattle and things like that. Right. And they're going to then say, what's this stuff? Reverse engineer it, work out what it does, and then maybe they'll be able to use it to blind our radar. Well, in truth, the Germans already had it. And their code name for our version, Window, was Dupel, okay? And it was so top secret in Germany that when we used it against them, none of their radar operators knew what it was because it was such a secret. No one knew about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's why it was so successful, because all the German radar operators up to a very senior level had never seen anything like it before, but the Germans did have it. And so our argument, or the argument made by those in, those in the scientific establishment, the naysayers, let's call them, were probably wrong, very likely wrong. But it did lead to a delay of several months before Window was used, and it did lead without a shadow of a doubt, to thousands more bomber crews. That's British and American and Australian and New Zealand and Canadian and all the other nationalities who fought in the Allied cause, and Polish and French. It did lead to thousands more of those air crews getting shot down and losing their lives. That delay cost thousands of lives.
I would never want that kind of responsibility, but it's a war. They have to make these decisions and live with them, not unlike Frost leaving those men behind on the beach. It's just incredible. And again, even now, the story is not over, because this new technology, the way they can counter the German radar, it's going to affect the V1 and V2 rocket production, and it's going to affect D-Day as well. So I'll leave it up to you if you want to talk about that or if we want to leave something for the listeners. But this story is far from over. And the way it just weaves through, it's a combination of technology and bravery and just, as you said, balls of steel earlier. But it was something they had to do, or they were going to spend the next 10 whatever years on the defensive, as opposed to what Churchill wanted to do, which was take the fight to the Nazis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just touching upon the V1 thing and then maybe rounding off there. But those first raids using Window, which were against Hamburg, and Hamburg was the most heavily defended city in all of Western Europe at the time. Right. Massive, flak towers, radar towers, massive night fighter defenses. And in the summer of 43, the first use of Window on a massive bombing raid over Hamburg. And there are these transcripts of the German radar operators looking at their screens, going, "My God, my God! The British are replicating themselves." Thousands and thousands of echoes of bombers all across their screens. And over those 3 days, Hamburg was decimated. And again, Hitler's told the news and he's apoplectic with rage. But Churchill realizes that this incredibly simple piece of technology is scoring such incredibly amazing results. And he says pretty much immediately, you are now going to fly further and harder than you've ever flown before, and you'll use Window as the way to blind the enemy to what you're doing. And no one was told the actual real nature of the targets. They were told they were going to bomb a radar factory. In fact, they flew through to the German V1 and V2 development factories and laboratories on Peenemünde, and they bombed them very, very extensively. And that led to the SS demanding that the V1 and V2 development production fell under SS control, not Wehrmacht, not military control. And it led to them moving all the production and research underground into these tunnels, burrowed into the mountains. And it put back the V1 and V2 program by months, which in itself had a massive impact on the outcome of the war. So yeah, in terms of the stealing of a radar, the simple theft of a piece of top secret technology, and all the incredible ramifications from that, this was a mission which changed the course of the war.
And we're going to leave it to the listeners to find out how Window played its part in the D-Day landings. And again, listeners, we have left out so many people, so many details. You're able even to bring in, just to paint a more fuller picture of stuff that's going on in the Pacific as well. So I encourage everybody to get this book. Mr. Lewis, thank you very much for your time. This was an incredible read. I don't know. Like I said, I just sat down and it was tense from the moment it started until the very end. And I'm not going to lie to you, at the very end, there were some tears. I'm strong enough to admit that. But when you put at the very end that the actual dish to this day cannot be located, I just have to say, when this COVID-19 scare is over, I'm going to come to your house, pick you up, and we're going to go find it together. And that will be your next book.
Hey, listen, I look forward to it, Ray. That's been really great. It's always good to talk to a fellow enthusiast, and that was very enjoyable. And I look forward to going on the hunt for the Würzburg.
There we go. So everyone, it's the book is Churchill's Shadow Raiders, The Race to Develop Radar, World War II's Invisible Secret Weapon. Mr. Lewis, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Hey everyone, Ray here. Thanks for listening to the episode. One last program note. This book will be available on April 28th, just 2 days from now. So make sure you check that out. Also, it will be available on Audible. So for those of you like me who are walking your dog 2 or 4 times a day, even though the dog doesn't want to go, now you have something to listen to.